Hi, I'm Lisa Fletcher, and you're in The Stream. Today, why are blacks and Hispanics in U.S. public schools more likely to face harsher discipline than other students? We look at how some students are caught in a downward spiral, often ending in incarceration. Our digital producer, Malika Bilal, is here looking out for your live feedback. Tweet her using the hashtag AJStream. So, Malika, among our online community, there doesn't seem to be much of a dispute over the fact that this school-to-prison pipeline exists. But there do seem to be quite a few questions.
Exactly, Lisa. There's a diversity about why this happens. And we're also hearing from a lot of teachers who are chiming in with their personal stories and experiences and anecdotes. So we'd like you, of course, to join that conversation. Tweet us your thoughts, your questions and comments. Use the hashtag AJStream.
And joining us in the studio today is Judith Brown-Dianis. She is the co-director at Advancement Project, a policy, communications, and legal action group committed to racial justice. Judith, welcome to The Stream.
Thanks for having me.
We are glad you're here. Our show is all about community. There are a number of ways that you can be a part of it, and we would like you to be. One is Google+. Just add The Stream to your Google+ circles, and you can be in The Stream. Now, here are some of the hashtags that we're following. According to government reports, black and Hispanic students in U.S. public schools are disproportionately disciplined, and that's led to the emergence of what many are calling the school-to-prison pipeline. Studies show that black and Hispanic pupils are more likely to be suspended or expelled, which some view as the first step toward incarceration. Take a look at some of these numbers. This is from Community Coalition, which is a nonprofit group. It says that 40% of students expelled from the U.S. schools every year are black. 70% of students involved in in-school arrests or referred to law enforcement are black or Latino. Black students are 3.5 times more likely to be suspended than whites, and black and Latino students are twice as likely to not graduate from high school as whites. So many are placing the blame on the school's zero-tolerance policies, which provide really no exceptions and no leniency. Essentially, misdemeanors and behavior that previously would have just led to an in-school reprimand can now result in an arrest. A child as young as 5 years old has been handcuffed for having a temper tantrum, while there are reports of other students having been arrested for throwing erasers and breaking pencils, the majority of whom are black and Hispanic. Now, with a growing number of districts hiring police officers to patrol hallways, are U.S. public schools funneling children into the juvenile justice system? Joining us now to discuss this via Skype is Garrett Duncan. He is the Associate Professor of Education at Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri. His research focuses broadly on race, culture, education, and society. Welcome to The Stream, Professor.
Thank you for letting me be here.
So, Judith, I want to start with you. What is the school-to-prison pipeline? Is this a new name for an old problem, or is this something that's just emerging?
Well, it's really emerged over the past 10 years. There had always been disparities, racial disparities in the way that school discipline was done in this country. In fact, in the 1970s, the Children's Defense Fund documented that. And we saw that in school desegregation cases in the United States. But then it kind of morphed into something much more serious, where the consequences for children were anteed up. And it was because we started to see this move around crack cocaine in the cities and a wanting to clamp down, and our children were called predators. All children were labeled predators. And so school districts started to take up a much more serious way of handling what was used to be, the thing that would cause you to go to the principal's office or get a call home to mommy is now the thing that the police officer steps into. And so it became known as the school to prison pipeline because it really is how the schools have become a connector to the prison industrial complex, and how while many of these children are not necessarily going into prison directly from school, they are being referred to law enforcement, they're getting a record, they may go to jail in some instances, and so at the end of the day, we know that the more likely, if you get suspended or expelled, you're more likely to wind up in the juvenile justice system, you're more likely to wind up in the criminal justice system, you're more likely to wind up in poverty over time, and more likely, of course, to drop out of school because you're out of school and not in class learning.
So, Professor Duncan, tell us what your opinion is on this topic in terms of what leads to this. What leads to the school to prison pipeline? I mean, some people suggest, it started at Columbine. Some people suggest zero tolerance policies. What's your thought?
Okay, actually, I agree with my previous, with my colleague, that things, and I actually differ. Things have intensified over the last 30 years, but this has been going on for over 500 years, and especially the main benchmark is Reconstruction. James Anderson, probably the foremost authority in the education of Black children and youth, said once the government intervened in the education of Black children and youth. Now, keep in mind, prior to Reconstruction and the Freedmen's Bureau Act, we had Black folks educating Black folks and raising the literacy at astronomical rates. But what he said is that the education of Black folks, once the government got involved, was about preparing them for Negro jobs. And Negro jobs are those jobs that were left over after full white employment. And so it has intensified in the last 3 decades. And this is why I agree with my colleague. But at the same time, this has been going on for a while. And the reason why it has intensified because of technological change, especially with computers and, automation, where, you render certain classes of employees obsolete.
Judith, it sounds like Professor Duncan's talking about racism.
Yes. At the heart of what is happening is we are seeing in schools the same thing that we're seeing in the criminal justice system. For African Americans and Latinos, we see, you can engage in the same kind of activity, but the book gets thrown at you harder, right? The offense gets really kind of anteed up. And so it really does mirror. The numbers kind of mirror the kinds of tactics that are used, and it really is that we are more harsh on children of color. And we see that in kind of all segments of what is happening in education and in the criminal justice field.
I think that's echoed by members of our community. There's a tweet here from Richie who says, "This sounds like a Band-Aid over a gunshot wound, treating the symptom and not the cause of why kids commit such serious crimes in school." But with that, I'd like to go to our Google Plus Hangout where we have Catherine waiting to speak to us. And Catherine is a teacher here in Anacostia in Washington, D.C. Catherine, go ahead. Catherine, it looks like you might need to unmute your microphone.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, yep. Thanks. Go ahead.
Okay, so my question is, at my school in particular, a lot of the behaviors that occur are exacerbated by these zero tolerance policies, and it just becomes this horrible cycle. So in light of that, what alternative school-wide behavior management strategies would you recommend for teachers and school systems?
Professor Duncan, would you like to address that?
I absolutely would. First of all, teachers, we have to keep in mind, teachers have so much authority in their classrooms. They have so much authorities in their classroom. And a lot of the zero tolerance programs begin with documentation at the classroom level. And all radical or progressive teaching understand teachers as being, autonomous people. And certain things that I saw in my classroom when I taught middle school and high school that might have led to suspension or expulsion, we kept it in-house. I would go to the parents. And that's one of the things that we might do because there is, and it's just this war. There's war on youth, there's war on women, there's war on people of color, and teachers have to understand their power in the classroom.
Judith, you talk to a lot of teachers. Are they fatigued? Are there more disciplinary problems overall now than there were 20 or 30 years ago, and are they just tired of dealing with it?
Well, I mean, so many teachers do say that, they think kids are worse than they were. Quite frankly, teachers are overreacting more than they had. And they are becoming, in many instances, not, more distanced from the community and from the kids who they're interacting with every day. And so I think part of what we have to do is put common sense back into discipline, right?
Thank you.
Let's get back to talking to parents, talking to children. Discipline is not about punishment. That's where we got off wrong on this. It's about teaching. It's that teachable moment where the teacher can say, okay, I have a decision to make. Am I going to teach this child how to behave differently the next time, or am I just going to push them out? And so I think that.
But are we talking about teachers that are willing to do that with white students, but they're not willing to do that with Black and Hispanic students?
So yes, so the research does show that two children who engage in the same behavior get disparate outcomes because the child of color is treated more seriously. We did some focus group with teachers a few years back, and I remember, watching behind the glass while there was an instance that was given, like, what happens if a kid does this, and there was a white teacher who said, I am scared of those big Black boys in my classroom.
Not scared of the big white boys,
right,
though.
Not scared of them. And it's part of our perception of Black children, especially Black males, Latino males. And so all of the experiences and our perceptions and our stereotypes get brought into the classroom. I often say, it's like we have a lot of George Zimmermans in the classroom.
You better go ahead.
I am not indicting all teachers by any means, because there are a lot of great teachers out there, a lot of great teachers who want to help kids and went into education for the right things. But we do have some George Zimmermans in the classroom that say, this child is suspicious, I am scared of them, I don't know how to interact with them, and I'm going to let somebody else deal with it. And I think that person should be a police officer because I think they are suspicious to the point that they're criminal.
So in predominantly Black and Hispanic schools, do you see the numbers shift? Do you see a more fair dispersion of expulsions and suspensions, or do we still see these
Unfortunately, we don't. I mean, but again, it's because the teachers in the classroom in those schools also see those kids as suspicious. So it's so this.
One of the things, when we talk about predominantly Black and Latino schools, we're talking about the students. I've taught both in Southern California as well as in St. Louis. We don't talk about the teaching force. And one of the things that happened as a consequence of the Brown decision was that most of the teachers of these Black kids and these Latino kids are white middle-class women who first came into middle classness as a result of going to teacher education program. And I don't mean to disparage them, but they're coming into a situation that is unlike any that they've ever seen. And so when we talk about, being scared of the big Black guy or the big, most of the information they get about their student population is from the media and from New Jack City and from Boys in the Hood. And so we need to understand that. So we need to name everybody involved and not just put it on the children. We need to also name the educators involved.
Well, speaking of naming everyone involved, I'd like to go to Alfonso and Google Plus because he has a comment about parents and their role. Alfonso, go ahead.
Good afternoon. I've been listening to the conversation, and I think that we're making several overgeneralizations. I'm a former high school administrator and teacher in several jurisdictions around this nation. And I don't think that it's a matter, first of all, I think it's an affront to everybody who's a teacher in this world to assume that we show up and we go into this field with the idea somehow that teachers are looking for kids to discipline. And, I certainly think that it's not a matter of the level of the infractions. I think somebody said something like breaking a pencil or talking back to the teacher. It's not those small infractions, but rather the way in which the students respond to teacher directive. Many schools around this nation now closely mirror social services agencies rather than institutions of learning around this nation. And I think that one of the things that we have to do is what the breakdown has been, not that the kids are worse, not that the kids behave any worse than they did 25 or 30 years ago, but the relationship between the school and the parent has deteriorated to the point to where it is now adversarial as opposed to being a collaborative relationship. And I think that if we start to work together again, my teachers are afraid to bring the issues up, because now not only do you have a confrontation with the child, you've now got a confrontation with the teacher. And in too many cases, people are just not willing to jump into that fight. I think that we're expecting far too much from the schools. If we get back to the fact that schools are there to educate, not to raise these kids, and not to teach character, values, morals, and all of the things that we're being saddled with these days, if we can get back to just teaching, I think that we can get a handle on these issues. Let's improve the parent relationship with the school. Let's demand that.
Judith, one of the things that I want you to comment on is,
with all due respect to the administrator, I think he's a little bit off base. As administrators and teachers, we are both moral and intellectual leaders. We live with children, these young people from K through 12, up to 6 to 8 hours a day. So we participate in the raising of these children. In fact, we're called parents, local parenters. And to abdicate that is a moral failing on that particular part. Also, the other, when it respects to the relationships between parents and teachers and schools need to take the leadership on that. Parents send their children to school. They're very actively involved in the education of their children when they get them up every morning and send their behinds to school. We have to understand that. And if there's a problem, most of the times when schools contact parents, they're contacting them about a problem.
Right.
Very rarely
Right.
do they tell them how well
That's
their
right.
students are doing. And so if there is a problem there, parents have this good faith understanding of teachers and principals and vice principals and assistant principals that everything is going well with their students.
well, you're talking about good parents, though, and not all parents are
No.
good parents.
I'm talking about, look, I've taught parents. Let's be clear. I've taught parents who were streetwalkers who actually lived with their children or
Okay.
their child
Okay.
in a garage while she was doing her wear. This person brought me a birthday cake on my birthday because she said I was doing right by her child.
And I
didn't
think
eat
that
cake. I'm not gonna lie, I didn't eat that cake. But at the same time, so even you have a street worker.
All right. Listen, I want to shift the discussion here a little bit. I want to talk about the effect that police and metal detectors have in a lot of these schools. Right. Judith, I want you to comment on that first. But I want to get to Dennis Wynn in our Google Hangout. He's a college senior. He went to high school in Brooklyn. He's Puerto Rican. And you've had some experiences in high school. I think, Dennis, you actually said that it was more like going to a prison. I want you to talk about your experiences to set up this upcoming discussion.
Well, hello. My name is Dennis Wynn, a rising senior at Middlebury College. Originally from Brooklyn, New York, Puerto Rican and Irish descent. Well, going to high school let's start at the beginning. The first period. The first period didn't begin with the happy expectation of another school day. It began with this take off your belt, take off your shoes, full body scan, metal detector, airport security routine. And when you have to experience that, your morale is not at the highest it can be. It has the potential to be. And as far as what the expectation was in my high school, I'm only speaking from the high school student perspective, is when the expectations are not as high because of the school's entire dynamic. It really doesn't breed high motivation, to say the least. So in my school specifically, we shared facilities with 2 other high schools, where going from 5th period to the lunchroom was somewhat frightening because there was the risk of a fight breaking out, and then the police becoming involved after the school safety, et cetera, et cetera. So really, that doesn't really mold those who want to do well. It doesn't put them in any kind of enlightening situation.
So Judith,
really
how do you balance the safety and
right? So I think this also gets back to the point about the relationship between schools, community, and parents and students, because when you start to make a school feel like a prison, you're not going to be able to build trust with the students who are there, because they're immediately thinking, you think I'm a criminal, not a student. And so this whole, we're spending millions and billions of dollars on school security, again, and really without cause, because we're not talking this. Guess what? Columbine, they don't have police officers walking through the halls, nor do they have metal detectors, right? Because they realized that what they needed to do was spend time building relationships with young people. That's the takeaway from them. It wasn't about how we throw police at the problem. And in a place like New York City and other big cities where you already know that there is a bad relationship between police and communities of color, to then inject them into the halls of a school system, and in many instances where they haven't actually been trained to be in the school, so you're taking the rogue officer from NYPD, putting him in the hallway to deal with young people, and he hasn't had training on youth development, it really exacerbates problems, it creates tension, and it does not create a good learning involvement, nor does it make students feel safe. We work with students in Philadelphia. Philadelphia has problems with violence in their schools, but I will tell you that students feel like police are not the answer to safety for them.
Right.
That's echoed again on Twitter. Ruth Lyon says the presence of police in schools can begin to worry the students, making them act nervous and react out of impulse. But Professor Duncan, I want you to weigh in on this, because there's also a tweet from Mohammed who says police presence is the least of some of these schools' worries. There are middle schools with drug and gun problems. And then Richard Golding says, if police presence keeps schools safe, I have no problem with it.
Well, we have to understand what is the safety issue. That is what I'm asking about. The only time we really hear about this being popularized is when something happens in Columbine, or something more recently in a movie theater. And the fact of the matter is, we have to look at infrastructures within the school, and I wonder if the violence is being overemphasized with students of color and in urban schools. And I will say this, I agree with my colleague who spoke before me, but I will not say schools are becoming more prison-like, because what prisons are no longer what we think they are. They're becoming warehouses. And so schools are becoming warehouses. Noam Chomsky mentioned that 15 years ago, that they are like warehouses, and we have a completely different economy. Schools are about civic engagement. They are about cultivating the hard skills to engage in the economy. But when you have a displaced economy, and we can just look at our presidential race, and nobody's talking about that. And so schools
we've got
are warehouses, as one warehouse to the next warehouse.
We've got about 2 minutes left in the show, Judith. I want to get to some solutions. I know that your organization has been working on some new disciplinary codes.
Sure.
What are some of the good things that are happening?
Sure. So there are great things happening across the country. So we worked with Baltimore City Public Schools, and we redrafted their school discipline code to take out some of the really trivial things. Because again, we want to have safe schools, but we want to have great learning environments. And so we took out some of the policies that really created this kind of subjectivity around, disobedience or disorderly conduct. And as a result of that, the suspensions in Baltimore City have come down by more than 60%. And we're seeing graduation rates go up.
We are out of time, but I want to pick up right with that in our online post show. So thanks to Garrett and to Judith and to our online community. Sit tight, because we're going to continue this discussion. And you can also see more on today's topic in this week's Fault Lines. They're going to look at the impact of Get Tough laws on growing up in minority urban communities across the U.S. It's called Baltimore, Anatomy of an American City, and it examines the cycle of poverty, crime, and incarceration in one of America's toughest cities. So make sure to catch Fault Lines. It's on Al Jazeera at 9:30 GMT Wednesday. It's repeated at 3:30 GMT on Thursday. In the meantime, we are going to continue this discussion on aljazeera.com. We're actually streamed at aljazeera.com. So type that in and catch up with us in about 10 seconds. So welcome back to the Streams Post Show. We're continuing our discussion on the effects of U.S. public schools' zero tolerance policies and this thing that is called the school to prison pipeline. Judith Brown-Dianis, co-director of the Advancement Project, our in-studio guest. We were just talking about some of the things that are working and that Advancement Project is working on to move this issue in a positive direction. Continue your thought.
Right. So the work that we've been doing is really about getting this common sense back into discipline and really trying to have schools look at this differently. First, let's take out the policies that just don't make sense. So it is the disrespect of authority. Why do you have to be out of school for 1 to 10 days for disrespect of authority, right? There are other ways, and giving schools alternative ways to handle those issues. And then also having schools really look at their racial disparities. So like I said, in Baltimore, we rewrote the discipline code. They used to suspend kids for being late to school or for actually cutting class. You'd get suspension. Well, actually, that's what anybody who cuts class,
that's kind of a
what
reward,
they want.
isn't
Right,
it?
exactly.
Yeah.
So we took that out of the school discipline code. The fact that you miss school altogether, you don't get suspended for that any longer. You actually should be brought into the school, right? And so we did that. As a result, suspensions are down by more than 60%. In Colorado, in Denver, we actually rewrote their discipline code. And not only have their suspensions come down, and we've been looking at these alternative projects and ways of doing discipline, but also they have a very progressive discipline code because they actually have to monitor racial disparities and they have to do something about it. And so part of it is, how do we, as I said, get common sense back in? How do we make sure we're keeping schools safe and at the same time that kids are put on an academic track and not out of the classroom?
Well, Judith, you're giving specific examples, and before we headed into the post show, you spoke about New York. Now, there's a member of our Google Plus Hangout who is a parent in New York City, and that's Lynn Sanchez. Lynn, you had a question.
It's not so much of a question. Just wanted to pitch in. I'm a concerned parent leader with the New Southern Parent Action Committee and Dignity in Schools Coalition, and most of our work is based out of District 9 in the Bronx. We've been having numerous types of events like press conferences, march. We even had a people's hearing where we brought together two big entities, the Department of Education and NYPD, to come together for a people's justice hearing where they got to hear from the community, from students and parents on what was going on, because in New York City, over 95% of the arrests occurring in schools are Black and Latino, are targeted. 74% of these arrests are male students. So the idea of them coming to our neighborhoods, letting them know what's going on, and then from there forming a working group. It's a Bronx working group where we're talking about school justice and how we can reduce the number of arrest summonses and suspensions by implementing positive discipline alternative programs to help the children.
Right. Professor Duncan, I see a nod in your head.
Yes, because my sister here just introduced the term justice. And I think that is really important, because when we talk about discipline, I think we get it twisted. Discipline and punishment are not the same thing. My first principal, who's the best leader that I ever worked under, she said discipline is derived from the term disciple, a follower of a great teacher. And the teacher leader just introduced the term justice that I hadn't heard for a while into the equation. And we have to make sure that the rules are evenly applied across all populations. And I think that's one of the things she's bringing out.
Judith, you were talking about going into states like Colorado and Maryland and doing this work, but where does the change, who has to drive the change? Is it federal, is it state, is it local?
So who actually drives the change are parents and young people. The story of New York is that story. The story of Denver, Colorado is that story. We worked with a group called Padres and Jóvenes Unidos in order to get that done. It's because parents and youth, first of all, know exactly what's happening in their schools. Second of all, parents are the ones who can hold schools accountable, right? Vote the school board in, vote them out, vote the mayor in, and so a lot of this work is happening at a very local level, at the school district level, and it is around a movement that is being built at the grassroots, and they are able to create the context for this larger change to happen. And so at the state level, we've seen some change in state legislatures. We've had legislation passed in Colorado, but it's because of that group in Denver. At the federal level, because of the movement that has been built over the past 12 years, we have seen the Department of Justice and the Department of Education jumping in on this issue, doing investigations and making sure that there are no racial disparities in discipline.
Well, I know Dennis on Google Plus
that.
wants to jump back in here, but before he does, I'd like to read a tweet from Taz who says, we asked the question to our community, why are some students likelier to find police in their schools? And Taz responds, it's because they're Black or Latino, just my unfiltered first thought or answer from my experience as a public school teacher. But Timoteo responds, he says, I don't think this is simply a Black or Latino thing. It's about the environment that many children grow up in. And it's that environment, that socioeconomic status that I'd like to talk about as I transition to the question from Dennis, who wants to talk about resources. Go ahead, Dennis.
Hello, and thanks again. I think that's a beautiful way to segue into one of the main issues I saw being in my public school in Brooklyn and then coming to this private institution up in Vermont where the majority of the students had high school experiences where they were just completely incomparable to those of my own. And I think that brings to the question of what are we providing to these Black and Latino students in these public schools to stimulate them, to make them want to come to school? Where does the motivation come from? And when you look at the discrepancy between public schools in suburbia and inner city public schools, it comes down to a simple fact of how they're funded, and then where is the community morale being brought in from? The main fund for public schools in suburbia is from property taxes. That is an entirely new world provided to these students who are mostly white. These schools are majority white. They have fields to motivate them. They have athletic programs. They have in-school programs. They have reasons to want to do well, which leads to an entire different path than having police officers.
All right. Judith, I want you to comment on that. We've got about 30 seconds left.
Sure. I mean, just quickly, socioeconomic status really has nothing to do with how discipline is doled out. If you control for that, there's still disparities, racial disparities, poor kids and poor white kids and poor Black kids treated differently. And I think at the end of the day, that he is right. Our schools need more resources. They need to learn different ways of doing discipline. And our kids do need to be challenged. They're not being challenged in school because they're not getting what they need.
All right. Judith Brown, Diana Scarrett, Duncan, and everyone in our Google Hangout, thanks so much, and thanks to our online community. We want to jump over to Malika, who's got a few other leads that she's following for the day.
A 15-year-old U.S. high school student has invented a new test for pancreatic cancer. Jack Andraka, seen here winning a science contest for his discovery, developed an early detection test that's 168 times faster and more than 26,000 times less expensive than current tests. He's already applied for a patent for his project, a paper strip with a sensor to detect cancer-linked proteins. He explains it here.
And what I found is that my sensor in a blind study, it actually had 100% correct diagnosis in diagnosing pancreatic cancer, and it could diagnose the cancer before it actually became invasive.
Andraka used search engines and free online research papers to create his test, and netizens liked his approach. Peter Eggison tweets, "Think this is a great use of how informal learning brings brilliant results. Go Jack Andraka." Our next lead's out of India, where a hashtag criticizing coverage of Hindus is trending. For 8 hours, anti-Hindu media is the topmost trend, Kiran Kumar tweets. To sustain like that, thousands of tweets are necessary, shows India's frustration with the media. Or some are posting examples of coverage they say shows a bias against Hindus. Others noted the power of social networks to get the word out. Mahadevan tweets, social media is the medium where these anti-Hindu media get exposed time and again. They are mortally afraid of this medium. Well, in the sea of criticism, however, came a few voices of dissent. Joy Dust tweets, "Hey, anti-Hindu media trending is not proof that media is anti-Hindu. It's just proof that freakos tweeting in sync can make a trend." Well, that's a story we've covered here before, and we'll continue to follow it. So tweet us your thoughts using the hashtag AJStream. Lisa?
All right, and tomorrow on the show, we're going to look at a recent surge in attacks in the Ivory Coast, what's fueling the violence, and is the country about to sink right back into civil war? So tweet us your thoughts and your comments on that, and until then, we'll see you online.